Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carol Bernard, and I want to welcome you to our April Circle of Hope speaker series. We are delighted to have all of our panelists join us today for a very interesting discussion about the Safe Sex Worker Study Act. As many of you know, AMARA does not take a position on decriminalization of sex work, but we also do not stand in opposition to those who do. We do this to honor the lived experiences of our client population that is comprised of both sex trafficking survivors and sex workers. We work closely with survivor advocates and sex worker advocates on the issues that together we can address, like navigating the criminal legal system, harm reduction, uplifting their voices, and protecting individuals from exploitation, victimization, and criminalization. In our work, we see the continuum of survivors of sex trafficking and sex workers are sometimes shades of gray, not just black and white. AMARA seeks to be the bridge to discuss different relevant issues and public policies that would cause any unintended harm to our client population. Today, we will discuss the Safe Sex Worker Study Act, a bill that AMARA supports because we believe that data and information are critical to informing the work that we do and the work that so many of our partner organizations do, and to ensuring that representatives of our client population have a rightful seat at the table when it comes to legislation affecting their health, safety, and well-being. Today's panelists will inform us about this important piece of legislation. As always, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and our moderator will address them later in the discussion. We also welcome your feedback on our speaker series, and we will share a link to a short survey. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. I will turn it now over to our moderator, our lead Maryland attorney, Caitlin Bernidis. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So just to echo what Carol said, this is not a discussion about the repeal of FOSTA-SESTA. The Safe Sex Worker Study is simply calling for the collection of data to examine the harmful effects that FOSTA-SESTA may have caused to both consensual sex workers and human trafficking survivors. Information and data is vital to the work that we do, and is necessary in order to move the fight against trafficking forward. Now to our panelists. Katie Adamo, she, they pronouns, is a partner at Reframe Health and Justice, a collective working at the intersection of harm reduction, healing justice, and criminal legal reform. Kate draws on a background of community organizing, lived experience, training, direct service, and program development focused on health and wellness of people in the sex trade, including survivors of violence, exploitation, and trafficking. Kate currently works in policy advocacy, training, and technical assistance for service providers and capacity building for sex worker-led campaigns. Mariah Grant is the Director of Research and Advocacy with the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center. She is a human rights and migration specialist with a focus on migrant and sex workers' rights, freedom of movement, and labor exploitation. In her role with SWP, she oversees policy advocacy and development of original research, including ongoing studies on law enforcement violence against sex workers. She's worked throughout the US and internationally on improving anti-trafficking policies to ensure better human rights protection for migrants and sex workers. R.J. Thompson Esquire, he, him, is a longtime human rights lawyer, organizer, and educator, as well as a certified personal trainer, go-go dancer, and performer in the adult film industry. Prior to joining the Sex Workers Project as managing director, RJ worked at the Fairport Project community educator at Lambda Legal. Previously, RJ served as director of the Human Rights Program at the Woodhill Sexual Freedom Alliance, where he advocated for the human rights of sex workers during the first UN Universal Periodic Review of the US. RJ was also the National Campaign and Advocacy Manager at the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center in New York City. He was a membership program coordinator at the US Human Rights Network, where he organized Southern NGOs to meet with the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants. And finally, Tamika Spellman started working with HIPS in June 2017 after being a client of theirs when the organization first opened its doors in 1993. She started by volunteering with mobile services, then moved on to be a peer educator, while also working with the secondary syringe exchange program. In 2018, Tamika was promoted to become the Policy and Advocacy Associate, and in 2021, she became the Policy and Community Engagement Manager for the HIP Advocacy Department. She's testified numerous times on behalf of HIPs at DC City Council meetings, spoken on several harm reduction panels, and is managing the SWAC coordinator and a community organizer for the Decrim Poverty Movement. She's also advised congressional representatives on proposed legislation and continues to consult members of Congress throughout the legislative drafting process. Thank you for joining us all today. So I want to start off with a question for the panel. Can you start off with a summary of the reasons, sorry about this. Sorry, my computer is giving me technical difficulties. Can you start off by defining sex work as well as a brief summary of the reasons people may go into sex work?
All right, I'll kick it off. So at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center, we define sex work as a very broad umbrella term that encompasses a wide range of work sectors, some that are legalized and some that are criminalized. This includes go-go dancing, stripping, adult film production or performance, full service work, escorting, cam work, certain types of massage work. And so it's a very broad umbrella term that refers to really any exchange of money or something else of value in exchange for sex or a sexual or erotic service by consenting adults.
Okay, and this next question is for Mariah. For those who are new to the subject, can you please provide some background on FOSTA-SESTA and why did it gain so much traction?
Yeah, and I also want to thank Amara Legal Center for putting together this really timely and important panel and bringing together some of the great minds working on these issues. So SESTA-FOSTA was the law that was passed. SESTA is the Senate bill that was passed, and FOSTA is the House bill that was passed in both chambers in Congress. It was passed in April of 2018. So we just passed the 4-year mark of it being a law throughout the United States. So to understand what SESTA-FOSTA does, you need to go back to sort of the origins of laws that provide oversight of the internet. So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was passed in 1996, it creates protections for online platforms for the content that is shared by users so that they're not held liable criminally or civilly for content that is shared by those users. So when you think of what you post on your social media page, that is content that you are sharing. So your speech is your own and not the speech of the platform by which you've posted it. So for instance, Facebook is not going to be held liable for the content that you share. So SESTA-FOSTA is the first time that there's been a carve out of that protection of liability for online platforms that no longer protects them for speech that is shared by users that is related to sex work, what's in the legal document as prostitution or sex trafficking. So if content is being shared that, as SESTA-FOSTA is written, facilitates sex trafficking or prostitution, the platform itself could then be held liable. Both there's civil liability and criminal liability that is created through SESTA-FOSTA. So it was messaged and marketed as an anti-trafficking bill, but because of the way that it is written and including sex work and content that is shared that could be seen as facilitating sex work, what we saw the reality is that in the days immediately after its passage and even leading up to its passage, we saw a lot of sex workers being kicked off of online platforms that they previously had used to engage in harm reduction practices such as abetting and making sure that the clients that they were going to see were safe individuals, sharing information among community about clients or different ways of engaging in harm reduction tools. So it really is a law that, while it was messaged as being about trafficking, has had really very little impact on the ability of law enforcement to investigate and prosecute trafficking, but has had a huge impact and a very harmful impact on people who trade sex and use the internet to stay safe in doing so. So it's been in place, as I said, for 4 years, and also something that's really important for people who may know a little bit about this, but may not be as well versed in sort of the timeline of what happened. In the days and months leading up to the passage of FOSTA, there was also an ongoing investigation into Backpage, and Backpage is a site that a lot of people who do sex work use to identify clients, post ads, and it was also a site where at times people who are experiencing trafficking were also having ads posted about them. So it was a site where both consensual adults engaged in practices related to their work, and we also saw that some harm did occur on that site as well. And through that investigation, it was taken offline, but that actually happened prior to the passage of FOSTA. So when we talk about and apply, like, what were the outcomes of FOSTA, sometimes people are actually speaking to what were the impacts of Backpage being taken down, but that actually occurred prior to the passage of FOSTA. So it's important that people understand the timeline in which things occurred. I also encourage folks to look at the Government Accountability Office report that was released just about a year ago on the impacts of FOSTA and really what they found. And they're a nonpartisan group that does research of different types on government offices. So what they found was that it actually really hasn't been effective at addressing trafficking, and it hasn't been utilized by law enforcement to investigate or prosecute traffickers. So that's a really important point, that while it was messaged as an anti-trafficking bill, what we see in reality is that it's really not being used in that way.
Thank you. Kate, has any data collection been done regarding the effects of FOSTA-SESTA, either at a local or national level?
That's a great question. And thanks so much for having this panel and this conversation. You know, as you would expect, and really kind of what happens in a lot of different community spaces is that when something like this occurs, when FOSTA-SESTA passes, when it impacts a lot of people, the first people to know about it, the first people to really document it are people experiencing it and are community-based organizations. And so as soon as FOSTA-SESTA passed, we started seeing impacts immediately. Not only had Backpage gone down, but within about 20 minutes of the bill passing through Congress, before it had even been signed into law, it literally took 20 minutes for the first website to go down. And we saw dozens of websites go down after that in the weeks following. And so it was really important to just talk to each other and find out what was going on. And so everyone kind of mobilized in the way that they usually do, and as you would expect. And so immediately we started doing outreach, actually reaching out to groups like HIPS, places that we knew were doing outreach to sex workers before and after. And as things were developing, we were talking to each other and you know, and we're talking about text threads. We're not talking about, you know, peer-reviewed pieces, but just communicating and saying, what are you seeing in Seattle? What are you seeing in San Francisco? How is this impacting people? Talking to each other and encouraging community organizers to come together and discuss what was happening, to not just kind of document what's happening, but also what are the best practices? What are people doing to survive? And sharing that kind of information and doing that kind of community-based research was really what was happening. In the months following, different community organizations continued to do that work. I think the best report that came out of this was from a sex worker-led group called Hacking Hustling, which not only did online interviews, but also did outreach to street-based sex workers in one specific area to coalesce the data together. And, you know, I think it's amazing to see this kind of mobilization happen. And it's really challenging. It's local groups, it's small community-based organizations that are mostly volunteer run, talking to each other and asking about this and really getting rich and robust local information. But that's who was doing the work, and that's who was using their capacity to do this research. And so that's what we have on the ground. That's what we have as far as, what is the research and the data that's been collected, is sex workers leading the charge and saying, it's important that we know what's happening, and these experiences cannot be erased, and we have to communicate them and share what's going on in these communities.
Thank you. RJ and Tamika, as service providers on the ground, what did you observe after the passage of FOSTA-SESTA in terms of what sex workers were experiencing?
A lot of confusion, for one. It was confusing to people that they could not access these websites. And when they found out what it was all about, it was a lot of just awe that the government had that type of power. We saw an 83% jump in the amount of sex workers returning to the streets, because a lot of them did not have means and ways to connect with the remaining websites. So there was a big uptick in the amount of girls that had to return to street-based sex work, which has a whole set of issues in and of itself, which also relates to the next thing that we saw, which was a significant uptick in violence against street-based sex workers, which is a huge problem that after so many years of work in the community, we see that as a huge issue, and it is brought by big government. So those were the immediate things. And then on the longer term, there have been upticks in HIV. Girls don't have much choice right now, especially with the pandemic coming in and behind these massive changes, and I have reached into other areas. I am in 2 different national sex worker groups. And these are things that are not just happening in the District of Columbia. These are things that are happening all across this country, even in rural America, where people have less opportunities to return to any other form of sex work. When they had those online venues taken away from them, a lot of people couldn't switch to the other platforms. There are barriers to those. I initially was able to do so, but then when it got to a point where they've moved to Bitcoin, that's out of my realm. I don't know anything about that. I'm not trying to waste my time. It's too many things that have been barriers to staying safe and being able to communicate with other sex workers about our own safety. Prior to them shutting these websites down, we were able to communicate with each other relatively easy, cross-checking and referencing dates before they actually stepped across our threshold. Now that has been completely eliminated. And I've walked away from sex work because I'm not going back out in the streets. I'm 55 years old. That is not an option for me. I've tried to rebrand myself. I've tried to do the OnlyFans thing, but there are barriers to that now. And this to me is like an evolution of what SESTA and FOSTA was based in.
Now,
I would just second everything that Tamika said, and just add that from the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center perspective, our legal services have a particular expertise at the intersection of migration, sex work, and human trafficking. And so I always want to remind folks that any legislation that further criminalizes workers, and in this case, did so by, exactly as Tamika said, pushing people to do street-based work who had decided to do other types of work that were not street-based. When that happens for migrants, when that happens for any worker, it places them at greater risk of interaction with the police, which means greater risk of police violence, police sexual harassment, sexual assault, as well as arrest. And I also want to remind folks that every arrest is a trauma. Arrest in and of itself, whether there is a conviction, no matter what the result of that arrest, that is a traumatic, violent event. And for migrants, there are always collateral consequences for migration. And so sometimes we don't talk about that, but I want to name that because so many of our clients are migrants. And yes, I see in the chat, I would agree that policing, the way we do it in this country, is trauma in and of itself. And the only other thing I'll add as a male sex worker is that FOSTA-SESTA really highlighted for me, yet again, the disparities in which sex workers are targeted for criminalization and are most vulnerable. So while young male workers who do street-based work, there are street-based male workers in every city of this country. Those are mostly young people who are men of color, young men of color who oftentimes are living on the streets as well. While those folks were impacted directly by FOSTA, just like female sex workers were, the majority of male sex workers work on sites that were not impacted. And I name that because those sites are offshore and they have figured out loopholes to exist. Mostly because of US government raids that have happened in the past, like Rent Boy. So I say all that to say, a lot of male workers were able to shield themselves from the impacts because not every site went down. And I name that because there is a gendered and racial and class element to what sites are targeted. And once again, that impacts mostly women of color, trans women, and cisgender Black women in particular.
Thank you. And you both talked about street work. Can you elaborate a little bit more about the dangers of street work and why, whether or not it's riskier and why?
I quit doing street-based sex work. I think it was in 2014, the last time I walked the street. It was because I was being harassed heavily by the police. And then I did not want to continue to have my purse snatched. You know, I've been victimized by the police multiple times. You know, I'm tired of dressing in all black and hiding in the shadows when I see them coming. You know, I don't want policing in the way that they're doing. They need to leave the sex workers alone and be a little bit more proactive in what safety means for people. You know, because if I'm being assaulted, attacked, and whatever gamut that can happen out there, what about the people that live in this neighborhood that I'm walking through? You know, that same element of safety should be allotted to everyone and not targeting me because I'm a sex worker. You know, there are things that propel people to being stuck in a cycle. You know, when I got arrested, that took me away from meeting my objectives. You know, a lot of sex workers are in precarious housing situations. And when I was living in a motel, if I did not pay my rent the next morning, my things would be locked away from me, especially if I'm in jail. You know, and then there are sex workers that have medications they need to take. They don't have access to them. That throws off the whole cycle. You know, there are elements of safety that have been questioned as well because of policing. There were times when we were criminalized for having more than 3 condoms. You know, there were prostitution-free zones we had to go through. And this was all because of the gentrification that was taking place in the District of Columbia. You know, you're moving sex workers from a place that they are comfortable with, that they feel safer in than any other place in the city. And you're moving them along because you've decided that this neighborhood is getting ready to be gentrified. We're going to make this a business corridor. It's going to be an entertainment district. But did you consider the sex workers that were there and have a long history of being in this neighborhood and feeling safer there than any place else? You know, they did not think of the safety elements of the sex worker. They just felt like, hey, let's arrest them. We can arrest our way out of this. We keep arresting them, they'll eventually go away. That didn't happen. Life happens. People still need to be able to support themselves, have to pay bills. DC is not cheap. The average hotel in DC is like $200 a night. I couldn't afford to stay in DC. I came into DC to work. I had to move into other areas, into Virginia, into Maryland, so that I could afford to live, knowing that DC was my goal. And then when I was able to finally move back into the district where I consider my home, I am being criminalized at every turn. You know, they arrested me back to back. I ended up having a stay away order from a particular block. You know, you're squelching my rights. I have a right to be in any block in this city. I'm not violent criminal. I have never been violent to anyone, but I have been a victim of violence by the police and then other entities. And then I don't feel safe with the police around because they're not there to guarantee my safety. If anything, they'll sit there and watch. They see everything that goes on. I have no doubt about that. And I have seen them pull up after the fact and be like, well, if you weren't out here, that's the wrong approach. Somebody has been hurt. And this is your way of saying, well, if you weren't there, maybe it wouldn't have happened. Well, no, if you were actually a little bit more proactive, people would understand that it's a no-no to hurt anyone. You know, there are multitudes of ways that sex workers have been assaulted just for trying to do their job. Sex workers work. And we need to start looking at it as that I'm a consenting adult. I made a decision. Life was not easy for me as a trans woman. I've only been working a regular job that has been fulfilling and capable of keeping me from having to do sex work, and that is now. And that started when I was 50. I never had these type of opportunities before. I was always stuck in low wage jobs that I still was bound to doing sex work. So we're not going to change those types of scenarios. People need to lay up off of us and start helping us.
Okay. Kate, as a partner in Reframe Health and Justice, can you speak a little bit more about the health risks that sex workers may face since the passage of FOSTA-SESTA?
Sure, and I so appreciate the other panelists having foregrounded so much of this conversation. And I also really want to start by saying that, you know, there is nothing inherently dangerous or violent or negative about simply the exchange of sex for resources. Sex workers are put at risk based on how we treat and how we marginalize, how we oppress, how we police and surveil people who treat sex. And so, you know, as Tamika was saying, street-based work is, you know, not inherently more violent. It's not inherently more dangerous. It's just street-based sex workers face a lot of different forms of violence, harassment, and oppression because of being so public, because of being targeted, and especially because you're generally talking about folks where if you are criminalized, that means you are less likely to seek out support, whether that be support from law enforcement, probably support from service providers, support from other people in the neighborhood. And so when we do this, when we marginalize a community who is more likely to be women and femmes of color, LGBTQ, migrants, what we're doing is taking folks that are already vulnerable and putting a target on our backs. And so when we talk about the impact of FOSTA-SESTA, what we're really talking about is how have folks that traded sex used the internet and moved online in order to utilize harm reduction? How has creating that barrier and creating that distance made folks that are trading sex able to do things to stay safer and to stay healthier? And the impact of FOSTA-SESTA is about removing that form of harm reduction. Getting online is a form of harm reduction because we do see lower rates of violence, of STI transmission. We do see higher rates of things like condom use. And the reason for that is multifold. First and foremost, when you are in a private space posting an ad, you're not necessarily facing direct policing in the same way. And so you don't have to screen for police as much. You don't have to be as aware of policing. You don't have to watch out of the corner of your eye to see if there's a patrol car coming by every 45 minutes, because you know that they do, and you always have to watch. And so things like, I'm talking about, oh, thank you for that question. So harm reduction is a philosophy that says there is, that all behaviors, whether we're talking about sex work, whether we're talking about substance use, whether we're talking about driving in a car, I'm based in Baltimore, and there's a lot of harm associated with driving in a car in Baltimore. And so all of those behaviors have inherent risk to them. Harm reduction philosophies are community-based philosophies that say, how do we honor that person, honor that person's decisions, choices, and how do we reduce the generally system and structurally created harm that is associated with this behavior? And so whether we're talking about, if you're going to have sex, we recommend using condoms because that reduces the risk of STI transmission. To if you're going to drive in a car, we really would like it if you wore a seatbelt, because if something's going to happen, that reduces the risk of a head injury. And so it's a philosophy that you can really genuinely apply to almost to every single area of your life. And when we're talking about sex workers, we're talking about what are the behaviors that we can utilize, what are the interventions that we can make that reduces the risk of criminalization, because policing is traumatic, it's harmful. And so how do we reduce the risk of criminalization? How do we reduce the risk of violence? How do we reduce the risk of exploitation? And how do we reduce the physical health impacts of trading sex? And so when we're talking about moving into online spaces, what that provided for sex workers was a lot of different things. First, like I was saying, if you are negotiating with a potential client on the street, and you know that every hour on the hour, a cop is coming by, that client probably doesn't know that. And so they're going to roll up whenever they roll up. And if you have 15 minutes to talk to that client, to negotiate your boundaries, to negotiate condom use, to look in their car and make sure there are no weapons that you can see, to get a read to figure out if they're intoxicated or not, that's really important. If you know that that cop is coming in 5 to 7 minutes, all of that gets truncated to, can I get this client and can we just get somewhere else, because that is safer for me. I'm willing to take on risk with this client so that I don't take on the risk of getting arrested. And so it's things like that, that all of a sudden when you move online, you have the ability to have some of those negotiations a little easier. You can plan a little better and plan out your night and talk about what you're going to do. You can negotiate where you're going to go in a way that takes a little bit more time. It's not so rushed. You can have those conversations, and having those conversations, having more access to clients, having more clients to choose from, and more clients that you can say no to if you get a bad feeling from. All of that leads to reductions in all of those things. It also means that you're more likely to work independently. You can negotiate on your own. You don't necessarily rely on a third party because you can find clients independently. And all of that also reduces the risk of exploitation. And so when we're looking at what are the impacts on the health and safety of sex workers, when we're talking about FOSTA-SESTA, what we're talking about is, did we take away, because of FOSTA-SESTA, did we lose an avenue of harm reduction that was essential for a lot of people who were trading sex to be able to have the negotiations and conversations that they needed to with potential clients in order to protect their health and safety?
Thank you. And now this is kind of a two-part question for Mariah and for Kate. So the first part is, what data do we have right now about the health and safety of sex workers? And can you explain to our audience what the Safe Sex Worker Study is?
Sure. When we're talking about really robust data on the health and safety of sex workers in the United States, you're looking at a big old gap where there really should be a lot more research and a lot more information. Internationally, there is a lot of information. Locally, depending on whether or not there are service providers who are looking into this, there is some information. When it comes to robust, rigorous national studies on the health and safety of people that trade sex, including HIV, including STI transmission, including violence, even including trafficking, we're talking about nothing. And I do mean that in a very sincere way. And so I think that's one of the things, and I'll let Mariah talk a little bit about the bill, but I think that's one of the really important things that especially when we're talking to policymakers, when we're talking to administrative staff at the CDC, they're asking us if we can send basic information, because when it comes to the US, there is a chasm.
Yeah, so the Safe Sex Worker Study Act is a step towards filling that knowledge gap. So it is a study bill. It does not change any laws. It simply asks Congress to study the impacts of the laws that it is passing. So Safe Sex Worker Study Act was first introduced in 2020. In the couple of years since the passage of FOSTA-SESTA, it has been reintroduced this year on March 3rd, International Sex Worker Rights Day. So the Safe Sex Worker Study Act is a bill that specifically would look at the impacts of SESTA-FOSTA on people who engage in transactional sex. So that would be people who are sex workers, who are doing it as adults, who are doing it consensually. It would also look at the impacts on people who have experienced exploitation and trafficking in the sex trades. And it is saying the Department of Health and Human Services specifically needs to look at the public health implications of what happens when a group of people are kicked off of online spaces. So what occurs when suddenly overnight, as all of us have been speaking to, people no longer have access to these places where they once engaged in community building, harm reduction tools, vetting of clients, maybe not even meeting folks in person, but doing all of their sex work online. What occurs when they no longer have access to those spaces where they engaged in that harm reduction? And also, what happens to people who previously did their work online and now are facing potentially more risks of exploitation and trafficking? So what occurs? Because right now, we hear a lot of talk from Congress about needing to regulate the internet, have digital oversight, but they're doing it in a vacuum. They're not doing it with all of the information that they need. So instead of legislating based on data, they're legislating based on assumption. And the Safe Sex Worker Study Act says you can't do that anymore. You need to actually look at the impacts of this SESTA-FOSTA, of this first law that looked at Section 230 and started to create carve-outs of those protections from liability for online platforms. Because our real deep concern is that instead of looking at the impacts of SESTA-FOSTA on the range of people who were affected by it, we see that Congress is just looking to recreate it in different areas and apply the same logic behind SESTA-FOSTA to things like child sexual assault materials, and not doing it based in evidence, but just on the sort of messaging that comes with it that says, like, this is the way forward, this is the process that is going to be applied in different areas. And what our deep concern is that the harm that we see with SESTA-FOSTA is just going to be recreated and expanded to other communities. And we need there to be a real stop, and we need there to be studies, and there needs to be information that informs policy. So Safe Sex Worker Study Act, as I said, was reintroduced. So it's currently up for consideration in both the House and the Senate. On the House side, it was reintroduced by Representative Ro Khanna. On the Senate, it was introduced by Senator Elizabeth Warren. It is getting additional co-sponsors. Just today, Ed Markey on the Senate side has co-sponsored the bill. So we're seeing a lot of momentum. And really what we're asking is that this be the next step in digital oversight that the government takes. Instead of trying to change laws and potentially exacerbate harms, study what has been the effects so far. And I'd be happy to hear from other panelists, but also, like, part of it is that we see that the way legislation is happening in online spaces is reflective of what Tamika was saying about the physical spaces where sex workers have previously engaged in their work. The emphasis is on actually creating so much danger that these spaces are no longer safe or viable for sex workers to operate in, whether they be physical places or digital spaces.
I wanted to, I remember that bill because I helped to consult on it. It was a couple of people that I know locally and nationally that had consulted with Ro Khanna to create this bill. And one thing that was not talked about was the loss of income. I know what I used to make as a sex worker, working offline. And gratefully, I was able to replace my income by doing more hours and getting advancements with HIPS. So I fared this nightmare pretty well, which could have turned into a big catastrophic event for me had there not been a cushion to come in at that time for me. Because like I've said, I was stuck in low wage employment for so long that I never saw a way to get out. And I was stuck with doing sex work, which I'm fine with. Understand that it's not like I've ever been coerced or forced into doing it. It was a supplement to my income. And then there were times when it was my only income. And I've done pretty well and been able to always take care of myself until that point. I was nervous, and knowing that if that was my case scenario and I was able to shift around, I probably could have learned about the Bitcoin and figured out how to do that. But then what about those that weren't able to do this? It's not just a Tamika thing. This is a national problem. Do they understand how many people's lives they have affected in this attempt to shut down trafficking when they're going about it by the wrong way? That is not the way to stop the trafficking issue. Number one, they need to do is fix the immigration system. We need to do that. That is what we should be doing. Instead of them doing what needs to be done, they're coming at us with all of these laws that are bringing in more criminality instead of addressing the issue at the root. And that is a lack of resources. Resources are the problem and the reason why trafficking situations exist. If I did not have access to the things that I've had access to, I may have been a victim of trafficking myself. But the way the system is set up, it is not helpful. It does not bring in the correct resources. Policing cannot be the answer to it because it doesn't fix the problem. It leaves me still as a victim and not be able to move forward. Resources meaning opportunities for education, employment, living wage employment. Let me make sure I say that. Housing. We need stability. And when they came in with this law, it created a monumental, unstable economy for people that traded sex. And it was not fair. This is why I consulted on it, because this is a big issue across this country. How many people I've talked to locally, how many folks I know on a national level, and how they're echoing the same concerns and they're worried about their constituents. It is time for us to look at this and treat it as what it is. Consenting adults do adult things. And we need to stop minding what people do so much as to opening the door and having these conversations around safety for everyone. No other job, no other entity that works has no safety element to it except for sex work. And it's not fair. They talk about this physical labor thing. Boxers do physical labor. Football players do physical labor. It's no different. Do not discount what I do and not say that it's work. We need to be treated equally. And that's what I wanted this law to do, was to open the door to that conversation to what is supposed to be equal, just, and fair.
I would like to add, first of all, thank you, Tamika, for speaking all of that truth. I would like to add, in addition to being a sex worker of 25 years, I'm also a human rights lawyer, and I would be remiss to not say, I will say it till my dying breath, no matter how unlikely people may think it might be in the United States of America. The things that Tamika just listed that we need: housing, universal healthcare, education, universal housing, universal healthcare, let's start calling all of it universal education, are human rights. They are not charities, they're not benefits, they're not services, and they are more than just necessary resources. They are rights by virtue of each of our birth, And the United States has ignored economic and social rights purposefully, not accidentally, but purposefully since the 1940s. You can read Eyes Off the Prize if you want to learn about that purposeful history, but we must demand these things as rights, no matter how long it takes. We need to demand it by talking to our elected officials, by writing our elected officials, by doing op-eds, by dinner table conversation, and start changing the culture in this country to a human rights culture so that it becomes understood, whether we see it in our lifetime or not, that it eventually becomes understood that the United States can no longer, particularly as one of the wealthiest countries on the planet, ignore these things as rights. We have the money to have a disgustingly robust military industrial complex, overseas military bases around the world that we're spending money on, policing and imprisoning people who have no business being in prison, and yet we can't have the political will to have universal housing, healthcare, education, and I would say thriving wages, not even living wages for all people. There shouldn't be one homeless person in this country. There are countries like Cuba that have virtually zero homelessness as poor island nations. So it's about the will to do it, and it's about the masses, civil society demanding it every day, no matter how many times we have to say it.
So in the last few minutes before we open up the Q, 3 or 4 minutes before we open up the QA, also let me say thank you for speaking these truths. How would the Safe Sex Worker Study affect you directly, as well as the populations you serve, and why is it so important?
So I think one thing that is really important about this bill is that you're really not going to find bills that look at the impact of a lot of policies that get passed. That is something that it seems like policymakers are really allergic to sometimes. I'll never forget one advocate who works in trafficking said trafficking is a movement of outcomes or outputs and not outcomes. We don't consider the metrics of anti-trafficking that less people are trafficked, that the vulnerabilities that lead people to be trafficked are addressed, that after a trafficking situation, people move on to living wage jobs, to having secure housing, to never be afraid of being trafficked again. We don't consider those metrics. We count posters. We count how many outreach hours were spent. We count murals that got painted that said, "We love you." We don't actually count the lives of people before and after their trafficking situation as part of our fight in anti-trafficking. And so this bill is important for a lot of reasons. And first and foremost, it's because it asks us to actually look at what happened after we passed a policy and learn and try to do better and expect that we will and can do better. And then secondly, and the way that this bill came together was, if you look at the bill, as Mariah was saying, it directs HHS to do a study. And if you look at the things that are asked, it's very specific. It is impact on reliance on third parties. It's impact on negotiations. It's impact on violence. It's impact on access to resources, like Tamika was saying. This bill was written by looking at, and those conversations that I mentioned before, how the organizers were just talking to each other and saying, what's up with your folks and what's going on? And we took everything that people said, this is what happened to me afterwards. This is what happened to someone I organized afterwards. And we took that list and we turned that list into the questions being asked. And so this is also the only bill in Congress that was written by sex workers, by a sex worker, that was directly informed by community-based research on folks that are experiencing the impact of FOSTA-SESTA. It's the only bill that does that. And it's the only bill that also says we need to talk about sex workers as people. We don't just need to talk about the crime of prostitution and assume that the people who are impacted by that law are covered. This actually is the only bill that talks about sex workers as people and as a community and as people who actually do have health and safety concerns that need to be brought to the table. And so naming this as a community, naming sex workers as human beings, regardless of their experiences with the criminal legal system or with exploitation, looking at people that trade sex as human beings with health and safety risks that are further being marginalized. This is the only bill in Congress to do that. And it frames it in the way of public health and not simply, you know, service provision. As important as that is, you know, it's not the numbers of people accessing services, it's people who are engaged in this specific experience and actually naming the humanity and the dignity that they deserve. And so I think for me, there's a lot of things that this does. And I think that being able to stand up and say that this bill was written by impacted people who are directly informing the questions that we need to ask, I think that that is a sense of integrity and dignity that, you know, as someone who gets to do policy work, who gets to talk to policymakers, that is a recognition of my basic humanity and dignity that has never been true before. And so I think that, you know, it's gonna give us a lot of information. It's gonna hopefully open the door to a lot more research. And I can't tell you the overwhelming pride I have with standing up and actually being recognized as a person.
Can I just add real briefly, Caitlin, because I know a lot of the audience is anti-trafficking advocates. I want to name that the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center and many other sex worker rights organizations are anti-trafficking organizations. We are not different than an anti-trafficking organization in the sense that we have served trafficking survivors for over 20 years every day. And so when people talk about, so the conflation of sex work and trafficking is extremely problematic, but so is the false dichotomy that people paint between human trafficking survivors and sex workers, because we're talking about spectrums, as Carol said in the opening statement, and people find themselves at different points on that spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion at different points in the day, at different points in their lives. And I would also really ask that if you're an anti-trafficking advocate that works with organizations or people that tends to think they know better for other people's lives, to really question that and to really think about why it is that any person or organization thinks they know what is better for our lives. As Tamika said, adults can do what they want with their labor, with our bodies. That's called bodily autonomy and self-determination. These are feminist principles. These are human rights principles. And people need to stop with the missionary mentality and the savior complexes in the anti-trafficking movement, because it does nothing to eradicate trafficking and it only causes further harm.
And I know we have like limited time, but I will just kind of piggyback on what RJ was saying. For folks who are interested in supporting the Safe Sex Workers Study Act, part of the historic nature of this bill is that it isn't just, we want to see it passed, we want to see it implemented, we want to see the data that comes out of these studies, but we also see the introduction and the conversations that are being had with congressional staff as part of the history of this bill. And those conversations are happening right now. We encourage folks who do sex work, have experience having done sex work, to set up meetings with congressional staff, call your congressperson, express your support of this bill, and talk about why it is so important, because part of it is that we have to normalize these conversations with lawmakers. We have to normalize these conversations with people who make policy that impact everyone's lives, impact sex workers' lives, impact trafficking survivors' lives. And as RJ was saying, we have to move beyond this false dichotomy between people who've experienced sex trafficking over here and people who are sex workers over here. It is not two different groups of people. Everything that impacts a trafficking survivor in policy impacts sex workers, and they can be one and the same person and have those experiences in different points in their life. And so having conversations with staff about this bill is a critical step in moving those conversations forward and making sure that policy no longer represents this false dichotomy. We need laws that protect everyone.
And I wanted to interject that I was hoping that the Safer Sex Worker Study Act would be a new era in how we are checking and balancing laws that are implemented, policies that are moved across Congress. Like, we need to be checking other laws. The war on drugs is one. We need to be looking at how we can go back and fix some of these issues that we have been forced to live with for decades. And these policies around sex work and trafficking are two of them that definitely need to be checked.
Thank you. So I'm going to move this over to the Q&A and some of the questions that we've received. One of them was from Shibundo from the HIPS and SWAC. The question was, expounding on Tamika's point, do other folks on the panel have thoughts how recent criminalizing moves or discrimination against sex workers have affected peer organizing and community amongst sex workers?
Yeah, one of the growing areas of kind of understanding, and again, you know, when we're talking about harm reduction, yes, but when we're talking about a lot of these things, people experiencing harms know first. And it's usually, it's not, you know, communities are doing research all the time because that's what community means. You talk to each other and you find out what's going on, you find out what works. And one of the things that community has known for a really long time is that financial discrimination is a massive problem. And over the last couple of years, it's really gotten a lot worse. And especially as we moved all into much more digital spaces over the last 2 years, you know, think of 5 years ago, how many people had a Cash App? How many people had Venmo? How many people had all of them? And sex workers have been experiencing discrimination from not just these new digital spaces, but from just straight up banking for a really long time. And that has led to a lot of ramifications, both for community organizing and for sex workers directly. When people are unbanked and when you're living in a cash economy, that does a lot to really preclude you from doing things like getting a lease. You know, how hard is it to get a lease anyway, and to not have, you know, years of W-2s and not even have a bank account? How does that happen? And people being unbanked not only means you're more likely to face theft if everyone knows you're a sex worker and you have to operate a cash economy, theft from going home and leaving a club at 4 o'clock in the morning and getting on a subway with your entire take for the night. All of that puts you at risk. And if you can't do that, if you don't have access to banking, a lot of times what people do is they end up reliant on other people, sometimes managers and third parties, and definitely on partners and peers who might exploit that person, where they might experience more violence. And in community organizing, it's made it really difficult because sex workers are flagged, because sex workers are criminalized. That means that there's a lot more precarity in that. And so community organizing, especially when we found out just the depth of need for mutual aid, for how important it was for people to go and say, I need $100 and that's all I need this month, but I don't know where else to get it. All of a sudden you're sending $100 to this person's sex worker account and this person's sex worker account, and everyone's accounts got shut down. And that was happening throughout the system. And it's something that, you know, sex workers are known for years. When I was doing my very first harm reduction trainings years ago, everyone knew if you use PayPal to get some of your money, to get a deposit, to confirm a client, take that money out immediately, because PayPal is going to shut down your account and they're going to keep all your money. And we were doing that years ago. And so there's been a kind of a growing awareness of the importance of financial systems, the importance of banking, and how much people, and this is true for trafficking victims, very much so, migrants definitely, you know, how different communities are actually not able to access the banking system that most of the rest of us completely take for granted. And that is really a growing awareness that hopefully sex workers will be a part of that dialogue as people who are really experiencing in real time what these changes are looking like.
Thank you. And so I know we said we'd be wrapping up around 1. I did get permission to continue 10 more minutes if our panelists don't mind, and if anyone else, any of our attendees don't mind staying on a bit longer. If not, you can check out the full recording later on our YouTube channel. So just trying to get to all the questions. We did have a slightly answered question, but I did want to pose it to the panel. Could you take a minute to define what type of harassment individuals on the street have been experiencing? Is it sexual abuse, physical battery, verbal abuse? And I saw Tamika respond to that, but I did want to open it up to the panel.
Yeah, so it cut out a little bit, but I think I heard that what kind of harassment are people experiencing on the street?
Yes.
Right.
So it didn't specify on the street, but I believe when it was sent, when we were talking about street-based.
So all of the above, everything that you named, physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual harassment, sexual demands from police, which is sexual harassment. This is nothing new. It was only exacerbated by SESTA FOSTA, but these are things that street-based workers have always endured, and that has, that goes, there's very little accountability for police in this country, as we've seen very clearly in recent years, as some of us have known for decades. There is just a great deal of immunity, but when it comes to sex workers, because we and our work are so undervalued and so stigmatized, the police harassment and violence that does occur, as well as interpersonal violence with clients and managers and others, is often unaddressed. And we've seen, particularly in New York City in recent months during the pandemic, that even after we've had advances in public policy in New York State, like the repeal of walking while trans, aka loitering for the purpose of prostitution, police backlash in the form of an even greater lack of responsiveness when people actually are victimized and need assistance, the police turning a blind eye to that. So it's not only the active harms that police are engaging, the active violence and harassment, but also not doing anything when people actually need them. And those two together are a really deadly combination.
And I'll just add to that. Oh, sorry, Tamika. I'll just quickly say that right now we're studying forms of accountability that people who engage in sex work, people who are part of sex worker rights organizations, might utilize when police have committed acts of violence against them. So we're currently studying like what is available if you have experienced harassment from a police officer. And the reality is that there's a complex web of laws that protect police officers. There's also just informal ways in which we all see with what is happening with policing in this country, that police officers protect each other when they commit violence against many different populations, including sex workers, at really high rates. And so it's really challenging when people do experience violence at the hands of police. It's law enforcement that is committing that harm. And so where do you go at that point? And it can be really, really isolating when people experience harm at the hands of police officers because of the limitations of where you go with that. And we also see that sex workers face a lot of retribution when they actually come and say, I have been harmed by this law enforcement, that it is a lot of fear that comes with that, and a lot of physical and emotional violence that can happen when you do actually stand up and say, I have experienced this type of violence. And then also there's very limited ways in which you can seek legal redress against law enforcement. So I would just ask that anybody who is looking at solutions to trafficking that expand the criminal code, that expands the power of law enforcement and police specifically, that they really consider that police have actually been a source of harm and are not going to be the solution to addressing trafficking.
The one thing that I did forget to put in my answer was extortion, because they do take money from sex workers quite often. Some of them are pretty much pimping girls so that they can work. I've had them come up to me knowing that I just got out of someone's car. Hey, I need some lunch money. I'm looking at them like, seriously, what? And they're expecting me to give it to them. And I gave it to them so that I can continue to work. So that's another one of those things that they do to street-based sex workers.
And what Mariah just said really about the notion that police are here to protect, if the Black Lives Matter movement has not awakened people of privilege to that reality, people that there are two very different experiences in this country of people who feel safer with and by and around police versus people who know they are less safe with and by and around police. And I'm talking about an institution and a system. Yes, there's exceptions within the police of people who do good, but the system as a whole does not make people safer. And by people, I mean the most marginalized people, right? Migrants, trans people, Black people, poor people, homeless people, drug users, sex workers, and on and on. So if you are still an organization or working with an organization that thinks policing and further criminalization is a solution to anything, not just trafficking, but anything, then you really have to look at your analysis around racial justice and economic justice, or if you even have an analysis about racial and economic justice.
And one last question to wrap up our conversation. Why do you believe the Safe Sex Worker study is so, why do you think it's beneficial, and why do you think people should support it and should call their Congress members to support it?
If we do not put a stop to them with these laws that are useless, just imagine what they're going to do next when they're going to encroach upon you and your families. You know, we're supposed to be a law-abiding society. We're supposed to be the leaders of the free world. I don't feel free. And until we start checking their power, the few lording over the many, it's not going to stop. They're going to take away our rights categorically. I'm tired of my body being monitored like they own it. And if we do not stop them, that is the direction that they're taking us.
I think, you know, one of the things that we've seen in the couple of years also since FOSTA-SESTA is, yes, this has impacted sex workers. It's also impacted a lot of other communities, both for their proximity to sex workers, whether we're talking about sex educators, but also their profiling of sex workers. FOSTA-SESTA took the opinion that if you expand liability for websites that have anything to do with anything that they read as trafficking, that they'll police themselves, and they'll do it well, and they'll do it with, you know, the scalpel and not the axe. And that's not what happened. What happened was it is really easy to see all of a sudden sex workers as a threat and a vulnerability. And to say, okay, we can't identify trafficking, but we think we can identify sex workers, and it's just too much of a liability. It turned people who are most likely to be victimized into adversaries and not stakeholders and not partners, and definitely not people who needed that space. And over the last couple of years, what we've seen is this, that approach really become a dominant approach for a lot of other things. And when we're looking at the ways that people are seeking out very important information, we're talking about LGBTQ youth who are looking for information about their bodies and being coded as sexual deviants. We're looking at young people who desperately need abortion access information, and all of a sudden that information is criminalized too because it's liability. And it's just easier to cut off marginalized people who need that information than it is to say, you know what, I don't have the litigation budget to get to deal with the civil charges of this. I don't have $50,000 to prove that I was doing my due diligence when I was hosting this information, when I was connecting young trans people to other folks in the community, because this group all of a sudden thinks about the term grooming as very, very broad. And so when we're looking at who needs this and who is being targeted every time they expand liability, it is people who feel unsafe in physical space that sought out digital space to find that safety. And so I think, you know, if you're not sure about, you know, am I a sex worker ally? Fine. If you're not sure that that is an effective tactic, then this bill is going to tell us what happens when we utilize that tactic. And the other reason why it's so important for people to call in is because, so I've been advocating on the Hill for, I think, 5 years now. I actually used to work at the Sex Workers Project and started a lot of the federal work there 5-6 years ago. And when I started, sex work was a dirty word. And I had staffers literally say, look, I hear you, but I'm not allowed to say that. I've been told directly that I'm not allowed to use the term sex work. And it's scary. I get it. There's not a lot of polling nationally about, how this is going to play in the California 47th. But we need to start normalizing it. We need to start making it not a dirty word on the Hill. We need to make it so, yeah, people who trade sex have a voice. They have agency, they have thoughtfulness, they have insight that you don't and need to be listened to. When we were first doing the rounds after FOSTA-SESTA saying, look, this is what we're hearing from the ground, this is what we're hearing from outreach services, I'll never forget, we had a Democratic office who we spoke to before FOSTA-SESTA passed, we spoke to after FOSTA-SESTA passed, where we said, this is what is happening. And they said, look, we didn't believe you then, and we don't believe you now. And so what we need is as many people as possible saying, I don't know how I feel about sex work. I'm not here to tell you to decriminalize, repeal, whatever. I'm just saying that this is a group of people who has a specific set of information that is direly important and does need to be listened to and does at least deserve the dignity and respect of being brought to the table for the decisions that are impacting their basic survival. And that takes as many allies as possible, because every time an ally stands up, every time someone says, I don't even know how I feel, but I just feel that this group deserves a voice and a seat at the table, that is so, so deeply impactful. And it actually does make a difference. And it makes it not scary. And it makes it not, the third rail that LGBTQ used to be. What it makes it is simply a question of, do we offer sex workers, trafficking survivors, trafficking victims, people who are being exploited, people who have never been exploited, do we offer them the basic dignity of having a voice in this conversation?
So on that note, which I think is the perfect way to wrap this up, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking the time out of your busy schedules to speak with us today about this.
Thank you all for
Thank you.
attending.
Okay, and to wrap it up, I thank you all of our attendees for coming on and joining us today. You can find a recording of this on our YouTube page, as well as we will be sharing it on our social media as well. Thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.